The transport touched down with a groan of struts and the faint hiss of depressurizing seals. Dust lifted in pale ribbons across the barren strip of concrete, and the strange forms disembarking did not belong to Earth. They were gaunt, gray-skinned figures with elongated limbs and large black eyes that caught the light like mirrors. Shackles of reinforced steel bound their wrists, though their posture carried more exhaustion than defiance. Human soldiers in khaki uniforms flanked them, rifles held with professional calm rather than overt menace. No one spoke as boots and alien feet struck the ground in uneven rhythm. Captain Edward Mallory stood near the edge of the line, his jaw stiff beneath the weight of the moment. He had seen these beings in combat, ships burning in the sky, tracer fire arching upward, entire towns reduced to ruins by weapons no one could describe without trembling. Yet now, in this isolated corner of America, the enemy looked frail, almost pitiable. Their large eyes flicked across the camp gates and the watchtowers, then down to the dirt, as though afraid that looking too long might reveal some deeper vulnerability. One of them stumbled. A private started forward instinctively, steadying the prisoner with a hand on its thin elbow. The alien's head tilted, surprised, then wary. Mallory noted the exchange. Small, almost invisible cracks in the wall of hostility had begun. But cracks could widen, and that thought unnerved him more than open battle ever had. The column moved through the gates, barbed wire catching the sunlight in harsh glints. Inside, the barracks stood in ordered rows, wood and metal shaped with the efficiency of a nation at war. The aliens were herded toward one long building repurposed as their quarters. The structure had been modified with sealed windows and vents humming with filtered air, an attempt to respect whatever atmospheric subtleties the creatures required. Mallory doubted the engineers had gotten everything right, but so far the prisoners breathed without difficulty. Private Joseph Harlow, youngest of the company, whispered to his friend as the aliens passed. "They don't look like much. Thought they'd be taller. Meaner. Keep your voice down," Mallory ordered sharply. The prisoner's eyes might not betray understanding of English, but tone carried across any barrier. Respect was not optional. Mallory had drilled that into his men repeatedly. These were captives, not beasts. Among the aliens, one figure distinguished itself by carriage, if not by size. It held its head high, gaze steady, movements deliberate despite the shackles. The others seemed to look toward it instinctively, as though awaiting silent direction. Mallory marked this one immediately. A leader, perhaps a commander. It did not stumble. It did not falter. When guards gestured toward the barracks, it complied with the dignity of someone conceding a temporary loss rather than accepting subjugation. Their war had not ended in this camp. It had simply shifted forms. Inside, the prisoners were shown rows of bunks. The aliens did not lie down. They remained standing, clustered together, eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through thickened glass. Mallory observed them from the doorway, sensing tension among his men. Soldiers expected gratitude or fear. Instead, they received silence, unreadable expressions. A sudden rumble broke the stillness. One alien clutched its abdomen, emitting a faint sound not unlike a growl. Hunger. Mallory realized the last recorded transport log had been nearly 2 days ago. They had traveled across continents, then oceans, without nourishment. His orders were clear. Prisoners must be fed. But he had not considered what feeding meant for beings who came from another world. He left instructions with the mess hall crew, then returned to the yard. The aliens were already forming lines under the careful prodding of guards. It struck him that they required little force. They understood formation, discipline. Soldiers recognized soldiers, even across species. As the column moved toward the mess hall, Mallory walked beside them. Some of the prisoners glanced at him, quick, measuring looks as if trying to decide whether he was captor, executioner, or something else entirely. He wondered the same about them. The mess hall smelled of grease, bread, faint spices carried by the steam of food being ladled onto trays. For the American soldiers, it was ordinary even dull after weeks of repetition. For the aliens, it seemed an assault on the senses. Their nostrils flared, eyes widened. One recoiled slightly at the sharp tang of onions drifting from the kitchen. Mallory caught the gesture and filed it away. Their kind reacted strongly to scent. Useful intelligence, though he disliked the coldness of that thought. Trays clattered onto tables. The aliens sat stiffly, every motion uncertain. Before them lay food, patties of meat tucked inside soft bread, golden sticks of fried potatoes, a small dish of bright red sauce. Bottles of clear liquid beaded with condensation. Sprite. Mallory had ordered the soft drink included not from strategy, but from impulse. Something about its cold, fizzy sweetness seemed an appropriate welcome to Earth. Now he wasn't sure if it was a kindness or a mistake. The aliens did not touch the food immediately. They studied it, prodding lightly with long fingers, exchanging low murmurs in a language of clicks and tones. Mallory stood nearby, his men restless behind him. Finally, the leader reached forward. It lifted the hamburger with delicate care, tilting its head to sniff. The expression, if one could call it that, was indecipherable. Then, with deliberate resolve, it bit down. The mess hall stilled. A faint crunch of lettuce, the soft give of bread. The alien chewed slowly. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then its eyes widened fractionally, and the rigid posture loosened. It took another bite, faster this time. The others followed. Hesitation gave way to cautious sampling, then more eager consumption. A sound rose among them. Not quite laughter, not quite speech, but filled with something Mallory recognized as astonishment. Bottles of Sprite were lifted, caps already removed. The first swallow caused immediate coughing, the fizz overwhelming alien throats. Yet after the shock came a series of chirps, strange noises that seemed almost joyful. Mallory felt the weight of history tilting. He had expected suspicion, perhaps defiance. He had not expected awe, nor had he expected to feel something stir in himself as he watched enemies transformed by the simple act of eating. The leader lowered the empty bottle slowly, turning it in slender fingers. Its gaze met Mallory's. There was no plea there, no surrender. Only a question, unspoken but clear: why would a people offer delight to their captives instead of domination? Mallory did not have an answer. He only knew the war outside these walls had shifted in ways his superiors could not yet imagine. As the aliens ate, tension in the room eased. Soldiers exchanged glances that carried the beginning of reluctant respect. The prisoners chewed and swallowed, alien mouths stained faintly with ketchup. For a few moments, they were not conquerors or conquered. They were living beings discovering something new together. When the meal ended, the aliens were herded back toward their barracks. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Shackles clinked with less menace. Guards walked with less suspicion. Even the air itself seemed lighter. Mallory lingered by the door as the last prisoner filed out. The leader paused, head inclined ever so slightly, as if acknowledging something shared. Then it passed into the night. The captain exhaled, aware that the first day of captivity had not ended in fear or hostility, but in curiosity. And curiosity was far more dangerous and far more hopeful than any weapon carried onto this field. The next morning dawned gray and cool, mist clinging to the fences and barracks like ghostly veils. The camp stirred to life with the clatter of mess tins, the bark of sergeants, the shuffle of boots on gravel. For the prisoners, it was their first full day on Earth as captives, and their eyes betrayed both wariness and restless curiosity. Captain Mallory stood outside the mess hall once more, arms folded, waiting to see whether the fragile truce forged over bread and meat the previous evening would hold. He had not slept well. Visions of wide-eyed aliens choking on fizzing Sprite and devouring hamburgers returned to him again and again, accompanied by a question that gnawed at him. If food could dismantle walls of enmity, what else might follow? Inside the mess hall, the kitchen staff had prepared the same meal. There was no variety to offer, no elaborate menu to impress. Supplies were simple, and burgers, fries, and bottled soda were what the army could spare without disrupting its own men. Yet Mallory sensed that these ordinary dishes had become something extraordinary in alien eyes. He watched as the prisoners were filed inside under watchful guard. Their movements still carried stiffness, but a subtle difference emerged. Their steps were more purposeful, their heads lifted higher, as though anticipation had replaced dread. Private Harlow, assigned to the serving line, gripped the ladle nervously. He muttered to his companion, "What if they won't eat again? What if yesterday was a fluke?" Mallory overheard and answered before the other could. "They'll eat. Hunger is universal. But pay attention to how they eat. That will tell us more than any interrogation ever could." The aliens reached the tables. Again the trays were set before them. Hamburgers steaming faintly, fries glistening with oil, and chilled bottles with green glass catching the dim light. The leader, whom Mallory had mentally named the commander, fixed its gaze on the Sprite before even touching the burger. Its elongated fingers traced the curves of the bottle, fascinated by condensation trailing in rivulets. With a practiced motion, Mallory nodded to a guard, who twisted the cap open. The hiss of carbonation filled the air. The alien flinched, then tilted the bottle to its lips. The reaction was immediate. A shudder rippled through its frame, followed by a startled sound, a bark-like exhalation that drew startled laughter from the soldiers nearby. The commander set the bottle down, blinked rapidly, and then reached for it again with clear determination. This time, it drank longer, swallowing carefully. Its black eyes glistened. Other prisoners followed, some gagging on the bubbles, others clutching their throats as if betrayed by the liquid's sudden sparkle. But none abandoned the drink. They persisted stubbornly until they had mastered it. Mallory found himself smiling despite his better judgment. Here were warriors who had once wielded weapons capable of leveling cities, now struggling against soda. Yet in their struggle, he saw resilience, discipline, and even a glimmer of humor. One prisoner, after coughing violently, let out a burp that echoed across the hall. A ripple of alien voices followed, something like laughter. Soldiers chuckled in response. The barrier cracked further. The hamburgers drew similar fascination. The commander dissected his meal first, lifting the top bun and inspecting lettuce, tomato, and meat patty as though analyzing a piece of battlefield technology. It touched the red smear of ketchup and brought a finger to its tongue. Its eyes widened, and for the first time Mallory thought he saw something akin to delight. The bun returned to its place, and the alien bit deeply. A low, resonant hum escaped it, half growl, half purr. It was not a sound of anger, but of deep satisfaction. The others followed, some devouring rapidly, others pausing between bites to murmur in their clicking language. Mallory moved closer, studying faces. He wanted to believe he was seeing joy, or at least relief, but he forced himself to remain cautious. Yet the evidence pressed against his skepticism. Hunger had been replaced by indulgence, suspicion by intrigue. The commander, chewing slowly, set the half-eaten burger down and fixed its dark eyes on Mallory. The stare lingered until Mallory met it fully. The alien gestured, one hand to its mouth, the other lifted slightly, as if asking a question. Mallory guessed at its meaning. "Food," he said clearly, tapping the tray. "Hamburger." He repeated the word twice more. The alien blinked, then made a low repetition, a rough approximation of the syllables. The sound was imperfect, but unmistakably an attempt. Mallory's chest tightened at the realization. They were not just eating, they were learning. Harlow could not restrain himself. "Cap, did you hear that?" He said it. He said hamburger. "Quiet," Mallory snapped, though inwardly he felt the same astonishment. This was more than nutrition. This was communication, seeded in grease and sugar. Another prisoner raised its bottle and tilted it toward Mallory, emitting a clipped syllable that resembled a Sprite. A wave of murmurs followed among the aliens, all echoing similar sounds. Mallory felt a strange weight settle on him. They had seized the words eagerly, attaching them not only to objects but to an entire experience. Sprite was no longer merely a drink. It was a sensation they had never known, a discovery etched into memory. The meal stretched on. Guards relaxed their grips on rifles as laughter, human and alien, echoed softly in the room. An invisible tide had shifted. The POWs leaned toward one another, whispering, pointing, mimicking words, repeating hamburger and Sprite like talismans. Mallory saw it all and could not ignore the truth. The war might have been waged with bombs and plasma, but its true battlefield now lay in simple human pleasures. When the trays emptied and the bottles clinked hollow against the tables, the guards motioned for the prisoners to rise. This time, they obeyed more fluidly, their resistance softened. Yet one moment stopped the procession. The commander stepped out of line, burger unfinished in its hand. It extended the food toward Mallory, as though offering it back. Mallory hesitated, then shook his head. "Yours," he said firmly. "For you." The alien paused, then lifted the burger once more and ate the remainder in deliberate bites, its gaze never leaving Mallory's. A bond was being forged, fragile, wordless, but undeniable. As the prisoners were led out, Mallory lingered behind. The mess hall smelled faintly of ketchup and fried potatoes, the air still buzzing with the memory of alien laughter. He rubbed his temple, knowing the implications stretched far beyond this camp. A commander in his position was expected to keep prisoners orderly, to gather intelligence, to maintain security. Yet now he found himself at the center of something subtler, stranger, and perhaps more dangerous: trust. The young private approached him, voice low. "Sir, if burgers and soda can do this, what happens when they see more of what we've got? Music, books, cars, everything." Mallory did not answer immediately. He thought of the black eyes widening at bubbles in a bottle, the hum of pleasure after a bite of meat and bread. He thought of the alien's crude attempt at a human word. Then, he said finally, "We'd better be ready to prove we deserve their attention." The private nodded, though confusion clouded his features. Mallory watched the fog lift slowly outside the mess hall windows. A war still raged in the skies above, and yet here on the ground, another war had already begun, quieter, stranger, fought not with weapons, but with ideas carried in food and drink. Mallory left the hall last, closing the door behind him. He felt the story of the day settle into his bones. Enemies had eaten like comrades, and something irreversible had begun. Tomorrow would test whether it would hold. The days that followed established a rhythm. The prisoners marched from barracks to mess hall, consumed their rations with growing eagerness, and returned under guard. But each repetition carried subtle shifts. The first astonishment at hamburgers and Sprite had given way to something deeper: curiosity. They no longer ate in silence. Murmurs filled the air, clicks and low whistles rising and falling like waves, punctuated by clumsy attempts at English words. Mallory noted every effort, recording phonetic scraps in a notebook. Hamburger, Sprite, and Captain became anchors in the fragile bridge stretching between species. The commander had emerged as more than a symbol of discipline. It began to engage directly, pointing at objects, repeating words with insistence, demanding correction through gestures. Mallory obliged, careful to remain patient. At first the exchanges seemed rudimentary, but quickly they gathered speed. The alien was intelligent, keen-eyed, determined not only to learn but to master. Mallory recognized that hunger for understanding. It was the same hunger he saw in young recruits desperate to prove themselves. Here, though, it was stripped of rank and uniform, laid bare in the most unlikely of settings. A mess hall crowded with wary soldiers and bewildered captives. Private Harlow grew bold, taking to teaching without prompting. He pointed at his chest and said, "Joe." The alien repeated it awkwardly. The vowel stretched, the consonants softened, but the effort brought laughter from both sides. The private grinned, then pointed to the alien and waited. A pause, then a stream of syllables, harsh and rapid. Harlow frowned, struggling to mimic them. The attempt was poor, but the alien made a sound that might have been approval. Slowly, names began to pass across the gulf. The soldiers learned that some prisoners would respond when called. while others, shy or distrustful, stayed silent. Food remained central. Mealtimes became opportunities for exchange. Each bite of bread or sip of Sprite, another piece in an invisible negotiation. The aliens marveled at the textures and flavors, while the soldiers marveled at their reactions. One evening, Mallory watched a prisoner dip fries into ketchup, eyes narrowing in concentration as if decoding a hidden formula. It ate, paused, then repeated the gesture with clear purpose. When Mallory caught its gaze, the alien lifted the fry toward him, an unspoken invitation. Against his instincts, he accepted the offer, dipping his own and mimicking the motion. The alien emitted a sound halfway between a chirp and a chuckle. Around them, laughter erupted, and Mallory realized a ritual had been born. Despite these tentative connections, the shadow of conflict lingered. The prisoners were soldiers of an empire that had burned cities and slaughtered civilians. Some guards could not forget that. Mallory overheard grumbles at night. Why waste resources on them? Why teach them words? Why pretend they were anything but enemies? He kept discipline firm, but he knew resentment brewed beneath the surface. The men had lost friends in the war. It was no small thing to watch their killers sip soda as though they were tourists. The commander seemed to sense this tension. Its eyes lingered longer on the guards who scowled, its posture more guarded when soldiers muttered. Once, as trays were collected, it stood and spoke in its strange tongue, voice steady, commanding attention. The other prisoners hushed instantly. Mallory could not translate the speech, but its intent was clear, authority tempered by caution. The alien ended with a gesture toward the soldiers and then toward the meal. The message needed no words: eat, obey, endure. For now, survival meant acceptance. Mallory found himself studying the commander more closely each day. Beneath the gray skin and unblinking eyes, he sensed a mind as disciplined as any general he had known. What troubled him was not its authority, but its adaptability. This was no broken captive resigned to fate. This was a strategist biding time, learning every detail of human custom. And yet, Mallory could not shake the memory of the alien's hesitant smile after its first sip of Sprite. Could cunning and genuine wonder coexist? Late one night, unable to sleep, Mallory walked the perimeter of the camp. Moonlight glinted off wire and guard towers, the silence broken only by distant snores and the shuffle of boots. He paused near the barracks that held the prisoners. Through the narrow window, he glimpsed movement. The aliens were awake, huddled together in low conversation. One traced a shape in the air with its finger, as though sketching the curve of a bottle. Another mimicked the act of biting into a burger. The group murmured softly, their voices carrying tones of reverence. He realized with a start that they were recounting the meals as if they were stories, perhaps even lessons. To them, hamburgers and Sprite had become symbols. Of what? He could not yet tell. The following day confirmed his suspicions. During breakfast, one prisoner gestured to Mallory with a bottle of Sprite, then tapped its chest and spoke a word. The alien repeated the word several times, urging others to do the same. Soon the mess hall was alive with chanting. They had named the drink in their language. Mallory jotted the sound phonetically, unsettled by the fervor. The soda was no longer merely refreshment. It was entering their culture, reshaping their identity in captivity. Private Harlow leaned close, whispering, "Sir, they're worshipping it." Or something close. Mallory shook his head. Not worship, recognition. They found meaning in it. That makes it powerful. The private swallowed hard. And dangerous? Mallory did not answer. He knew meaning was always dangerous. It could unite or divide, heal or incite. The aliens had carried the war into the skies, but now Earth had struck back in a way no weapon ever could, with taste, with pleasure, with shared experience. By the week's end, mealtime had transformed from necessity to ceremony. Soldiers no longer stood stiffly by the walls. They sat at tables nearby, eating alongside the prisoners, conversation halting but genuine. Words were exchanged, gestures imitated, laughter shared. Trust flickered in the cracks of a war that should have left none. Mallory allowed it, even encouraged it, though unease gnawed at him. Each bond forged tightened a knot he did not know how to untangle. The commander remained the enigma at the center of it all. One evening, after the meal, it approached Mallory directly. Guards tensed, hands twitching toward rifles, but Mallory raised a hand to hold them. The alien extended its arm, hand open, palm upward. In its palm lay a fragment of bread, torn neatly from the burger bun. It pushed the piece toward Mallory with deliberate intent. Mallory hesitated, then took it. The bread was soft, warm from the meal. He ate it slowly, never breaking eye contact. The alien inclined its head slightly, then returned to its place among the others. The exchange lasted only seconds, but Mallory felt its weight long after. It was not merely a gesture of peace. It was something more intimate, acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. That night, Mallory considered what the camp had become. A place meant to contain enemies had transformed into something uncharted. The central conflict was no longer control of prisoners, but control of meaning. Who would define this strange communion? Soldiers hardened by war, or aliens discovering humanity's peculiar joys? He lay awake long into the night, certain of only one thing. The next step would change everything for both sides. The war outside the camp raged on, but inside the barbed wire another battle reached its quiet crescendo. Each day brought new words, new gestures, new threads weaving between captors and captives. What began with hesitant bites of hamburgers and startled coughs from carbonated Sprite had grown into something larger, more dangerous, and more profound: recognition. The aliens were no longer faceless enemies. They were becoming students of humanity. And humanity, through its soldiers, was learning what it meant to be seen by eyes that had once regarded them only as targets. Captain Mallory felt the weight of this transformation most heavily. His duty was to contain and manage, to ensure the prisoners neither escaped nor gathered strength. Yet the very structure of the camp was unraveling under the pressure of shared meals and clumsy laughter. He walked among the men and the aliens daily, hearing snippets of language exchanged, watching soldiers explain games of chance with cards, observing aliens mimic the act of dipping fries into ketchup as though repeating a sacred rite. It should have unsettled him, but instead it left him restless, caught between pride and dread. If a bond this strong could form over bread and soda, what else might it inspire? The commander, as always, remained at the heart of the shift. It had shed none of its dignity, yet its manner had softened. Where once it moved with the rigid bearing of a captive general, now it leaned forward in conversation, repeating human words, offering alien ones in return. Mallory noticed how the other prisoners followed its example. When the commander accepted Sprite without suspicion, they did the same. When it laughed at a soldier's awkward mimicry of their clicking speech, they too laughed. And when it tore a piece of bread to share with Mallory, it had been more than a gesture. It had been permission. One afternoon, during the meal, the commander rose suddenly and addressed both aliens and humans. The mess hall quieted at once. Its voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of command, though the words remained incomprehensible to most. But Mallory caught certain fragments: hamburger, Sprite, and a halting friend. The prisoners responded with approving murmurs. The soldiers glanced at one another, uneasy but intrigued. Mallory stepped forward, understanding that this moment demanded acknowledgement. "Yes," he said, pointing to the commander, then to himself. "Friend." The alien repeated the word clearly, then extended its hand across the space. Mallory took it. The hall erupted in noise. Not cheers exactly, but a sound of release, as though something long restrained had finally been allowed to breathe. That night Mallory sat in his office, staring at reports he could no longer write with honesty. How could he explain to his superiors that prisoners were no longer merely contained, but transformed? That they spoke English words with pride, that soldiers shared cigarettes with them in the yard, that soft drinks had become a bridge no policy could have foreseen? He knew his superiors would see only danger, contamination of discipline, a breach of control. And yet, in his bones, he felt that history was moving in ways no order could halt. Tension came the next day. A group of guards, less patient than Mallory's company, watched the aliens with narrowed eyes. One muttered that his brother had died in the bombardments, that he could not stand to see killers treated as equals. When a prisoner coughed too loudly, the guard slammed his rifle but against the table, shouting. Silence fell. The aliens froze, fear flashing across their faces for the first time since arrival. The commander rose, slowly, and placed itself between the guard and its fellows, hands raised, posture calm. No words, no defiance, only stillness. Mallory stepped in instantly. Stand down, he barked. The guard bristled, but Mallory's tone brooked no dissent. The moment stretched taut, then snapped. The guard retreated, muttering. The commander lowered its hands and inclined its head toward Mallory in a gesture that could have been gratitude or acknowledgement of shared authority. Either way, Mallory felt the gulf widen between what the army expected and what was truly happening. These were no longer just enemies. They were allies in the fragile experiment of coexistence. That evening, Mallory sought out the commander. They sat across from one another in the dim mess hall, long after others had gone. On the table between them lay an unopened bottle of Sprite. Mallory twisted the cap free and slid it forward. The alien lifted the bottle slowly, then placed it back down untouched. Its eyes fixed on Mallory, unblinking, and then it spoke. The word was halting but clear. Human. Mallory nodded. Human. The commander tapped its own chest. A string of alien syllables followed, softer than its usual commands. Mallory repeated them, clumsily but with intent. The alien inclined its head once, approving. Then it tapped the bottle. Together, it said, the word distorted but unmistakable. For Mallory, the simplicity of the statement struck harder than any battlefield revelation. This alien had no reason to see humanity as anything but an adversary. Yet here it sat, declaring union over a drink no general would have considered a weapon. Together, the war might not yet be won, but something irreversible had taken root. In the following days, the transformation spread. The prisoners worked with soldiers to clear the grounds, moving in tandem rather than under duress. They repeated words more fluently, even forming crude sentences. Soldiers in turn learned fragments of alien speech. A strange camaraderie grew, rough and fragile, but undeniable. The Hamburgers and Sprite became more than sustenance. They were the shared language of discovery, the tangible evidence that enemies could find common ground in the most ordinary of human inventions. Yet Mallory knew the outside world would not understand. Headquarters wanted obedient reports, not tales of prisoners laughing with guards. He wrestled with the conflict each night, torn between duty and truth. But when he looked into the eyes of the commander, when he heard alien voices struggle to form the word friend, he understood which mattered more. History would remember not the fences or the watchtowers, but the meals, the laughter, the moments when humanity revealed its essence not in weapons, but in generosity. The final proof came unexpectedly. During one meal, after the commander drained the last of its Sprite, it stood and raised the empty bottle high. In halting English it declared, "Human strong. Human good." The mess hall erupted. Soldiers cheered despite themselves. Prisoners echoed the words in broken chorus. Mallory felt his chest tighten as he realized the truth of the moment. The aliens had come to Earth expecting cruelty, and instead they had found kindness laced with salt, sugar, and fizz. When the meal ended, the commander approached Mallory once more. This time, instead of bread, it offered the empty bottle. Mallory took it solemnly. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. The war beyond the camp might rage for years, but here, in this unlikely corner, something greater had been forged. As Mallory left the hall, he carried the bottle with care, as though it were a relic. He understood that humanity's power did not rest in its machines or its armies, but in its capacity to share joy, even with its enemies. Sprite and Hamburgers had done what no treaty or weapon could achieve. They had conquered not with fire, but with flavor, not with fear, but with fellowship. And so Mallory thought, with a strange smile, that history would tell the tale not of battles won or cities lost, but the day humanity taught its enemies to laugh, to taste, and to call them friends. For in that simple act lay the truth no empire could deny. Humanity, for all its flaws, was worth knowing, worth trusting, and perhaps even worth following.